So we're playing white against weak move Wake, so we're going to play very aggressively. We still haven't had the chance to play a legitimate Danish gambit. Let's hope that we... still no Danish gambit. He goes knight c6. Okay. So what do we do in this position? We've already been in this situation before, and the instinct that a lot of people have here is to play d5, and I've previously explained why that's not my favorite move. And the short reason is that it closes down the center. Knight f3 transposes into a scotch, but I think the best move is actually just to take the pawn, right? Why? Well, first of all, this opens up the center. Second of all, this knight on e5 is actually not very well placed. It's very susceptible to a bunch of different attacking moves, one of which is f4, but f4 isn't the best move. It's a very common type of instinct, again, to simply attack the knight. Thank you, Chesto, but it's not the best because f4 is very weakening. It weakens the king, and it doesn't allow the bishop to develop naturally, so let's develop very flexibly. That knight is in the center, but it has no support. So we have a couple of ways to go about this. Let's start with the most flexible move. Let's develop a piece that we know we want to develop anyway. We know we'll develop this piece eventually. Which piece am I talking about here? These are kind of complicated concepts that relate to development, but they're very important. Yeah. So it's knight c3. Yeah. Because knight f3 is already quite committal, right? We offer the trade of knights. We don't know if we want to do that yet. Okay. Now the situation has changed, and the move knight f6 has actually informed us about what we want to do next. Thank you, Aliki Potato. Believe it or not, a move that previously was very weakening is now super good. Now, the issue with Black's play is that he's developed his two knights without moving out any pawns. And when that happens, the reason you move pawns out is not only to open up your pieces, it's also to give that exoskeleton to your position. When all you do is develop pieces without pawns, those pieces become unstable, and those pieces can be attacked by pawns. And I'm sure that a lot of you guys have seen instances of what we're about to do many times. We go f4, but isn't this move weakening? Well, it still is a little bit weakening, but now it's associated with a very strong follow-up, and that is e5. Sending this knight back to g8, and it is definitely worth it. Worth a little weakening, and also we occupy a lot of the center. Does that make sense? So he has to go knight g8, losing a ton of tempi. Then we bring our knight out, and his position looks very, very grim. He's not lost or anything. Jan42, thank you for gifting to House Party. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Okay. So will I try to castle queenside? I don't know yet. It depends on how he plays this. His best move would be d6. This guy is playing pretty well. Now, here's another tip for you guys. I think people, sometimes when you have an initiative, right, or you have a development advantage, naturally people try to avoid the endgame. But there are situations where going into an endgame does not necessarily lessen your initiative or the chances that you're going to attack the king. There are situations where endgames are actually just a natural follow-up to how you're playing. The fact that you're trading queens doesn't necessarily mean that you no longer have any attacking potential. We have a lot of pieces that aren't the queen. So this is a great example of that. Thank you, Herba Gurba. We can make a development move that does allow a queen trade, but in the event of that queen trade, he would have lost his castling rights and his king would have been a sitting duck. Instead, he goes bishop d7. Okay, so we're actually just going to castle because the king will still have a nice pawn shell. The fact that we move the f pawn doesn't make this king particularly unsafe, right? And he's doing us a big favor by opening up that f file. Thank you very much. Now his king is going to be in trouble. He gives us a check, and it appears that actually Black will develop his pieces before we do. But that doesn't matter because the f file is now open, and his development is very haphazard, super passive. That pawn in f7 is going to be the vehicle through which we develop a very quick attack against this king. I hope this makes sense so far. I know there's a lot of specific questions about what we're doing here, and I'll answer most of those after the game. He goes knight g7. Yeah, this guy is definitely good. Now, when we reach these types of situations, we need to be super careful about how we go about this. Knight g5 is the most tempting move. But when you make a move like knight g5, we all have to ask ourselves, well, what does this leave behind? How does that change the position? And remember that you do have an isolated pawn here. Let's not forget that. So what does knight g5 allow? What nasty response? And white is still good there, but it's not, I don't think there's a need to calculate this. Black can play knight takes e5. And that knight defends the f7 pawn. So we have to be very methodical about how we're actually approaching this question. And instead of knight g5, we can look around the board and say, well, what development moves can we make? What active moves can we play? First thing that my mind's eye sees is this bishop on c5, right? And bishop on c5 is undefended. Let's start with the move knight e4, centralizing the knight and attacking the bishop. I think that's a good starting point. So don't overthink these kinds of moves. I'm not like coming up with some crazy idea. I'm just improving the position of my pieces. This is probably not even the best move, right? I'm not even searching too hard for the quote-unquote best move. I'm just trying to find a good way to continue the initiative. There's many good moves here. All right. Then we're going to follow up probably by developing this bishop. Best square for the bishop is very clearly g5, pinning the knight. Yeah, even bishop h6 would be interesting, but okay, so immediately he blunders the knight. Knight takes c5. Okay, guys, there's nobody should ever be sending anybody hate messages. And that goes without saying. It's not welcome in this community. Yeah, I mean, if anybody gets those messages, that's just not right. There's trolls. But, yeah. So bishop back to c4. And we're basically winning. Okay. So, yeah, Gavir Molman, that's a great question. Why didn't we take the queen immediately? And that relates to the notion of whether it is a good idea to trade when you're up material. It is a super contentious question because there's a lot of, I would almost say, contradictory opinions on this question, right, of whether you're trading. And I always say the same thing. I think that a lot of coaches and chess content creators overemphasize the notion that you should trade when you're up material. Trading when you're up material is not inherently a good thing. It usually is a good thing to simplify because when you're up a rook, winning a position where you have a rook against a king is usually going to be easier than winning a position when there's a bunch of other pieces on the board. That's self-evident. But a lot of players turn this into, I have to simplify when I'm up material. And it's very easy. I see a lot of blunders that come from ignoring other features of the position in the hopes of simplifying, let's defend the pawn. And I also see a lot of beginners particularly be blind to attacking opportunities, again, because they're trying to simplify. So try to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. A lot of the time, if you have a good opportunity to simplify, you should go for it. But at the same time, if you feel like you can go for checkmate, that is often a far more effective way to end the game fast. Okay, so here, for example, I have an opportunity to trade rooks. Why not? Okay, and we're giving up the d file. That's not a big deal, though it's an endgame, particularly because we can take another pawn. The same goes for that advice I shared, which is that you shouldn't take too many extra pawns when you're already up a bunch of pieces. That should also be taken in its proper context. If there are free pawns that you can take without any consequences, then absolutely you should take more stuff. Okay, so again, now we're simplifying. Yeah, if you're someone who crafted any kind of hateful message, you should be very much ashamed of yourself. And, yeah. That's that. Okay, so let's go here. Then we're going to move the bishop back. And then we're going to win this pawn, and the game is over. We're up a piece. These kinds of endgames, the general conversion process to identify a passed pawn and promote it. What passed pawn should we identify, and how should we go about promoting it? Not the hardest question I've ever asked you guys, because particularly in light of his last move. All right, e7 is correct. e7 is correct. Digital Cosmos, he's a little bit underrated, but you know, we won a pretty convincing game. The game is over. Notice that bishop a4 would stop the pawn, but this knight on c5 is defending that square, and oh no, he doesn't resign. Thank you for the 300 chest down. Okay. Yeah, he was playing fine, although he was already in pretty big trouble at that point. Okay. You resign now, exactly. Okay, we make a queen. He doesn't resign. Now the most efficient mate is to bring this bishop down to d3, which forces him to weaken his king even further. Then we're going to mop up this pawn, swoop in with the bishop, and checkmate him on h7. Actually, there is an even faster mate than bishop takes g6. Could somebody find it? What is the fastest mate? 6,400. Wow. And Dikayo, thanks for being patient. Happy to get a game in with you before we analyze. Yeah, knight e6 and queen g7. Goodbye. Oh, he's got a check. I missed that. Doesn't really matter. And he has another check. So I guess he can prolong for 2 more moves. No, he doesn't. Okay. Dikayo, down for a game, if you're still up. Yeah, you can challenge me on the All My Lands account. Yeah, he found the best move, knight f2. A hillbilly attack from its most famous specialist. Alright. In the meantime, we can start analyzing. So, okay. Yeah, even GM's tunnel vision. No, totally. That's a big problem. So knight c6, d takes c5, right? So just to respond to this notion that the knight is in the center, right? Let's make a general statement here. Why is it even good for a piece to be in the center? What is it about the center that makes a piece good, right? Or makes a piece more likely to be good? Well, it has to do with square control, right? When a piece is in the center, mathematically speaking, it just controls more squares, particularly a knight. But controlling squares is not an inherently good thing, right? It's a good thing because it generally makes the piece more active. But you know, when you're on move 4, there aren't any weak squares, right? The weakness is the position hasn't yet been well defined, so it's a little bit less meaningful for a piece to be in the center. That's why you'll see some beginners go knight d5 in a position like this, right? Because you're taught to put your pieces in the center, but because your opponent has a lot of resources to kick away pieces, it's more important to develop quickly rather than position your pieces in the center. 100 bits, thank you. Absolutely. The Destiny Doge, thank you. Now, the other reason is that I can play a move like knight f3, and I can essentially offer a trade. And if you trade knights, then you have moved this knight 1, 2, 3 times. Trading it for a knight, that's only moved once. That way you lose 2 moves. That's not a good thing, right? And this queen is kind of nicely placed on f3. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Knight c3, knight f6. Now we play f4 and e5, now that this knight is a sitting duck. Knight g8. And time your questions to where we are in the game. So if you have a question about this position, this is where you should ask it. d6, that's correct. He's breaking into our pawns. And here's a good question for you guys. If he would have played bishop b4, should we go bishop d2? Is it a good idea to go bishop d2 and remove the pin? What do you guys think? We should do a poll on this, actually. This is a pretty important concept. So some of you saying yes, some of you saying no. The answer to this is, I'll give you guys a second to think about this moment. The answer is no. So there's two reasons, and not because it blocks the queen. Not because it blocks the queen. That's not the main reason, at least. So remember from the first speed run. Okay, let me explain it step by step. This is important. First of all, pins are naturally unpleasant. But there are two categories of pins. One of them is generally more dangerous than the other. A pinned piece that is protected by a pawn, that pin is generally going to be less dangerous and urgent than a pin in which the pinned piece, I call this the pinny, the king is the pinny, the blue piece, and the knight is the pinned piece. When the pinned piece is protected by a pawn, that piece is usually in no immediate danger, unless there is the threat of like black getting a pawn to d4. So that's something that's sort of beside the point here. But that lessens the urgency of this pin. I hope that makes sense so far. The second thing is I've always spoken about how pawn structure is a little bit less significant than most other things, like piece placement, particularly when you're a beginner. So think of it this way. What does black give up? What concessions does black make if he takes the knight? Let's say we go bishop c4 and black takes the knight. Well, first of all, black's made two moves with the bishop, trading it for a piece that's only moved once. He's lost the tempo. Second of all, black has given this bishop a very nice square. What square am I talking about here? What square am I talking about here? Yeah. And one of the problems with this trade is baked into the cake for black. If white brings the bishop to a3, guess what? Black has given up his dark squared bishop. He's given white the two bishop advantage. Black will almost never be able to play the d6, which is a crucial move that liberates his position. Black is essentially dominated here completely, right? And the last thing is, from a pretty simple perspective, black is now very seriously just underdeveloped. And after knight g7, white can just go after him. Knight g5 and queen h5, and the game is essentially over, right? So the last thing I'll say is that doubled pawns and pawn structure deficiency is generally going to be the most dangerous when it occurs near your king. If we were talking here about something on the king's side, and why did a king on the king's side? Okay, that's something you should attend to more carefully. If it's a pawn structure deficiency on the opposite flank from where you castle, it's not always necessary to make a very passive move, and bishop d2 is a passive move, right? That's not the key developing move. You would much rather develop this bishop first. So you just don't want to go out of your way like that to get rid of the pin. It also isn't necessary to encourage bishop c3. This is also overstepping it, particularly because you no longer have access to a3, right? But the middle ground here is just to ignore it and let your opponent do this. Now, am I implying that it's always a good idea to allow a move like bishop takes e3? No. Sometimes, you do want to deal with the pin. Sometimes you don't want to ruin your pawn structure. But a lot of the time, you should not be inherently concerned about your pawns being doubled. All right? Does that logic make sense? Does anybody have questions about how I explained this? I mean, hopefully it makes sense why you're not too afraid. The reason people are afraid of this is often because of the visual, like, look at those doubled pawns. They look horrible. But they're often not. Okay, great. I think it's an important point. All right, so d6, bishop b5. Now, if he had taken de, we would have taken on d8. Now, this is already an exception to the rule. Here, what would be a good move for white? Yeah, the c6 knight being immobilized is kind of good. So here, for example, taking is something I would consider. Now, first of all, we could play just f takes c5, and that would be perfectly good. But this is a pretty good alternative, because after knight takes c5, it centralizes the knight, forking the pawns. But this has less to do with the fact that we double black's pawns and more to do with the specific property of the position, right? The fact that we have a nice knight on e5. So in any case, well, waiting, I mean, you have to recapture the pawn, right? So in any case, that would be really good. He goes bishop d7, we castle, takes. Yeah, and here, again, if we had gone knight g5, we would have allowed knight takes c5. And that simultaneously defends the f-pawn. So that's why we decided to centralize the knight and attack the bishop. And now, had he moved the bishop back, bishop g5 would have been an incredibly good move, just pinning the knight. And after castles, I think that white has a crushing tactical move. And in honor of the plebs, maybe one of you guys can try to find this tactical idea. Stinimek, tier 1, thank you. How do I even know to look for this? Well, we have developed all of our pieces, and just look at the disparity in piece activity, right? White's got both of his bishops just slicing down black's position. The knight is centralized. We have a pawn on e5 that clamps down black's position. We have all of these positional advantages. And oftentimes when that has reached its apex, you need to start looking for ways to transform it. And the move is knight f6 check. And this forks the king and the bishop. So black is compelled to take. Now, this is a great example of where we wouldn't want to make a move just because it sets a threat. What recapture do you guys think is best between those two? It's actually the bishop, right? And the reason why is that this keeps the knight immobilized. It pins the knight. And taking with a pawn would have allowed black to play knight g6, bringing the knight into the defense. But by taking with the bishop, we set up the same lobster pincer mate theme. We will want the queen to end up on g7. There's nothing that black can do to stop it. So much so that, let's say black unpins himself, a very good move, quiet but deadly, would be bringing the queen up to d2 or to c1, threatening queen h6 or queen g5, depending on where black puts the knight. The game is over. That's it. There's nothing that black can do about this. This just illustrates how, piece placement is so important. You're down a piece, you're not even really feeling it. Knight g5 is good too. Yeah, knight g5 and queen h5 is also fine. All right, for sure. It's a force to me, yeah. So the computer evaluation after knight f6 check is +5. Black has slightly more resilient methods of defending, but by and large, this is just completely lost. Okay? So this is basically crushing. He plays bishop f5, and after taking on c5, right? We aren't really afraid of black not trading queens, because that would have given us, I would have encouraged this. This would have actually accelerated black's defeat. So does this make sense? Does anybody have questions on any of these moves? I mean, the rest is very obvious. I mean, we just played normal development moves and won quickly. The rest is obvious. Okay.